How reading Harry Potter can help you with your language learning. When you're learning a language, a big step is when you read your first book in your new language. I remember the very first foreign language book I read was Harry Potter in French. It was called Harry Potter à l'école des sorciers. And when I first saw the front cover, I was very pleased to know what all the words in the title meant. I had learnt l'école, which means the school, and I guessed that sorciers meant sorcerers or wizards, so the title meant Harry Potter at the School of Wizards. Off to a good start, I thought, as I opened the book, but that's where my optimism ended. The rest of my first experience reading a book in a foreign language was a disaster. The trouble was, I hadn't read the Harry Potter book in English, or even seen the film, so I had no clue as to what was going on. I only chose that book because I had heard it was popular, and I thought that perhaps it would be simple to read, seeing as it was a book for children. How wrong I was. The first sentence on the first page of this book was Mr. et Mrs. Dursley, qui habitaient au 4 Privet Drive, avaient toujours affirmé avec la plus grande fierté qu'ils étaient parfaitement normaux, merci pour eux. I went through this first sentence trying to pick out any words I knew. Et was and, toujours, always, avec, with, la, the, grande, big, merci, thank you, and pour, for. So, by replacing the words I knew in the sentence, I had managed to work out Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, qui habitaient au 4 Privet Drive, avaient always affirmé with the plus big fierté qu'ils étaient parfaitement normaux, thank you for eux. It made no sense to me whatsoever. I carried on like this for the rest of the first paragraph, and then I gave up. I don't think I read another book in French for at least a year. When you first start to read things in a foreign language, your experience could very well be similar to mine. However, I'm going to give you a handy tip that will make reading in a foreign language a far more pleasant affair. When you read something in a foreign language, read it in English first. The reason for this is because you don't want too much going on in your brain at one time. When you read something in a foreign language that you haven't read before in English, there are lots of things going on in your brain. Firstly, you're trying to work out what all the words mean. Then you're trying to stitch some sort of meaning together from those words that you understand. If you read whatever you're reading in English first, you'll make life a lot easier for yourself. If you already know what the text means in English, all you're doing is matching the words to the foreign language. You'll find it a lot easier to pick out words, and you'll be able to read it more fluently. You'll learn new words more quickly, you'll pick up unusual phrases and structures, and you'll get more confident in reading. Occasionally, you'll get to a structure or a phrase that just doesn't make sense. But if you already know what the English version means, you can just skip those really tricky bits until you get a bit more advanced in the language. Or you might be confident enough to tackle them straight away. Let me give you an example of how it works. We'll look at the same book that I read, Harry Potter. Firstly, let me give you the first few chunks of text in French, and you'll see how difficult it is to read them straight off the bat. Mr. et Mrs. Dursley, qui habitaient au 4 Privet Drive, avaient toujours affirmé avec la plus grande fierté qu'ils étaient très normaux, merci pour eux. Jamais quiconque n'aurait imaginé qu'ils puissent se trouver impliqués dans quoi que ce soit d'étrange ou de mystérieux. Ils n'avaient pas de temps à perdre avec des sornettes. Mr. Dursley dirigeait la Grunnings, une entreprise qui fabriquait des perceuses. C'était un homme grand et massif, qui n'avait pratiquement pas de cou, mais possédait en revanche une moustache de belle taille. Mrs. Dursley, quant à elle, était mince et blonde et disposait d'un cou 2 fois plus long que la moyenne, ce qui lui était fort utile pour espionner ses voisins en regardant par-dessus les clôtures des jardins. Les Dursley avaient un petit garçon prénommé Dudley, et c'était à leurs yeux le plus bel enfant du monde. You might have found that text hard to understand, especially if you've never read it before in English. So now let's look at the English, and then we'll go through it all again in French. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbours. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. Now, there are a few areas where the French text differs slightly from the English, but in general, if you read the English text first and then the French text, you'll find it much more useful as a language learning task. Another good thing to do is read both texts simultaneously. That is to say, read the English version, one sentence at a time, and after each sentence, read the French. You don't have to do anything other than read. Reading in itself is a marvellous tool to enhance your language learning. If you like, you could make a list of vocabulary you didn't know, but you don't need to. If you read the whole book, you'll come across the words so often that they'll just go into your brain without you even trying. Let's take a random sentence from the next paragraph in the same Harry Potter book. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. Now let's look at the French and compare. Mrs. Potter était la sœur de Mrs. Dursley, mais toutes deux ne s'étaient plus revues depuis des années. En fait, Mrs. Dursley faisait comme si elle était fille unique, car sa sœur et son bon arrière de mari étaient aussi éloignés que possible de tout ce qui faisait un Dursley. Most of this text is a word-for-word translation of the English, but there are a few bits that are different, and you'll start to get used to the differences in structure between French and English the more you read. Let's look at a few phrases we can pick up from this sentence. La sœur means the sister. En fait means in fact, which is always a useful phrase. Bon à rien, good for nothing. This particular sentence also has some useful structures, so let's break two of them down. Apostrophe S. The very first part is a good example of how the apostrophe S doesn't exist in French, so the words are switched around a little. Mrs. Potter était la sœur de Mrs. Dursley. Literally, that means Mrs. Potter was the sister of Mrs. Dursley, whereas in English we say Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister. As. The last part of the English sentence ends with as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. Well, the word un-Dursleyish can't be translated into French, so the translator has changed it around a little and said this. Sa sœur et son bon arrière de mari étaient aussi éloignés que possible de tout ce qui faisait un Dursley. That literally means her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as far away as possible from everything that made a Dursley. So the aussi que part means as in English. So aussi éloigné que possible, as far away as possible. Some other examples of this structure are Je suis aussi grand que Pierre. Je suis aussi grand que Pierre. I am as tall as Pierre. So aussi grand que, as tall as. Elle est aussi timide que moi. Elle est aussi timide que moi. She is as shy as me. So aussi timide que, as shy as. Ce n'est pas aussi bon qu'hier. Ce n'est pas aussi bon qu'hier. It isn't as good as today. So aussi bon que, as good as. Finally, once you've read the first page simultaneously in both languages, go back and just read it in French. You'll find you understand a lot more of it. Then, once you've finished the first chapter, you could, if you wish, go back and read it again in French without the English copy, just to see how much you understand. Language learning is about making little steps, and each step you take, no matter how small, allows you to say or understand something new in the language, and that's always a positive thing.